Hi! This time I wanted to talk about combat styles in role playing games. I think this is pretty complex. I'm going to talk about some realistic considerations when it comes to fighting styles, and then, or perhaps throughout that talk, I will point out some things related to mechanics and rules in role playing games. Truly a complex topic because there are so many styles related to unarmed fighting with weapons. Each weapon, each fighter can actually become highly specialized in the use of a single weapon, both in real life and in games. There are some weapons that share some similarities, but some others require a great deal of knowledge and practice. That's without even counting firearms. I think this is a good way to start this video. I've noticed that both in many games, role-playing games, video games, etc., they usually put a lot more focus on different unarmed or melee fighting techniques. And I was thinking, why is that? I think that's because, for example, firearms are somewhat recent. If we look to the prehistorical times, let's take a look at those cavemen with their primitive weapons. They had to develop some sort of methodology, even though they were not advanced, at least by today's standards. They had to come up with some way, some method, some more scientific approach, even though it's what you could say is primitive science and the use of primitive technology to be successful at slaying their enemies with their weapons. So that makes sense that sometimes firearms are not that developed in terms of fighting methods, at least when it comes to more overt or open martial techniques, because there are many military, paramilitary, and different groups, the private armies of organizations and such, that have very tight control over their methods and techniques when it comes to employing firearms. Here in YouTube, you can find some basic drills from different, usually from military guys or retired personnel, that tell you how, for example, you can roll on the floor and immediately stand up while shooting, or they carry out different drills on how to draw your weapon as quickly as possible. Sometimes in video games they also give you a somewhat realistic approach. In Metal Gear 3, Snake Eater, you had that CQC method that you put your knife under your gun and you moved forward with your gun in one hand and your knife in the other, so that way if someone gets up close you can quickly slash for example, the throat or the eyes of the enemy and shoot when it is necessary. And because of that, because we live in times of secrecy when it comes to different modern fighting methods, strategies, tactics, there are still many methods, techniques, forms, if you will, that have not been revealed to the public that different armies use. And because different martial methods of the past that have to do that have to do with the use of swords and axes and knives and unarmed fighting techniques, of course, we know about them because they are apparently not as useful in modern warfare when compared to the use of firearms or explosives or anything. So I think that's the reason why in role-playing games, video games, and even in other forms of entertainment, anime, manga, etc., movies, you see a lot stronger emphasis on the use of melee weapons and unarmed fighting techniques. There are some modern films, like all of those Bourne Legacy films, and you know, where they actually teach you some modern things, but there is still a very strong emphasis when it comes to unarmed fighting. I think this is also related because to the exchange of blows and strikes and locks and holds when it comes to close quarters combat. And even if you're using swords, axes, shields, there's still, yes, a more immediate exchange of attacks when compared to ranged weapons. In the past, you used to have, like I said, well, they were quite sorry, it was quite popular or normal to use bows and spears and javelins and in as ranged weapons, to use those weapons as a form to kill your opponent at a distance. But it was not as intense when it comes to the exchange of attacks or blows in close quarters, because maybe you shoot an arrow and then you pull out another arrow and you shoot it. You can still do it quite quickly, but when it comes to close quarters or even hand to hand, everything happens just so fast. A competent martial artist is able to exchange, if the circumstances are appropriate, you could easily exchange 5 attacks in a matter of perhaps 1 second or 1.5 seconds. It depends. Maybe you combine elbows with palm strike and then you make a fist and you strike quickly. It's quite doable. A lot of people thought that Bruce Lee was quite impressive because I don't remember the film, but he's able to enact, I think, 5 strikes in a single second or in 1.5 seconds. But for a capable martial artist, that's like the thing that you should be able to do. Not to minimize Bruce Lee's expertise, I think Bruce Lee was a good martial artist. Perhaps not the best, but he was still quite capable. And a lot of people ignore that Bruce Lee actually had experience in the streets. You can look for information, videos, books that talk about Bruce Lee when he was living in the East. In the movie Dragon, they paint this very heroic and virtuous lifestyle of Bruce Lee, but he actually had to escape to America because he was wanted by the police. He got into these very dangerous, potentially lethal street fights when he trained in the first style of the how do you call it in English? When in Spanish we call it the manos pegajosas. I forgot the name, the Asian name for it. But when he trained that style, it was quite usual for the students to be encouraged to pick fights, look for fights in the streets, and that's how they tested their techniques. And sometimes they actually got into fights with other schools. So yes, that's just a little bit of information to provide some context in that regard. So back to these fighting methods, the exchange is quite immediate. Even if we take firearms into consideration, as long as you have cover, even in the most intense firefights, as long as you are behind cover, you are somewhat safe from the enemy fire. And those of you that have been in very dangerous situations, let's call them like that, you know that there are also moments where you simply cannot take a breather because you are exposed, and if you don't move behind cover. Or there is an exception actually, but I will talk about that in a few moments. If you are not in a safe position, you're done for. But like I said, if you have the right position, you are somewhat safe. But when you are up close and personal, there is no complete safe position. Even the best guards and ways on how to parry and block, you are always exposed to the attacks of your enemy. When it comes to the exception in firefights, many of you know about the great gunslinger, lawman. Some would say that he is the embodiment of United States true sense of justice, if there was such a thing at one time, Wyatt Earp. Even with all of his personal flaws, he's still considered a hero by many. He was famous because he never got injured during the firefights, and he never moved at all. If you take a look at the historical records, he just stood there shooting. And some would think, how is this possible? You would think in a firefight you need to move from cover to cover and duck and perhaps roll, etc. But he just stood there with a very tranquil, perhaps comfortable way of killing his enemies. But it makes sense because in firefights, you usually, well, let's say in a firefight, the combatant would usually shoot that enemy that is moving about. It kind of catches your attention. The fight starts and you see someone running, you start shooting at that enemy. But if you stand still, sometimes it's almost like you become temporarily invisible in the perception, not that you actually disappear from the line of sight, but because you are not moving, you are not considered an immediate threat. It's somewhat similar to the way that eagles hunt. Maybe some of you haven't noticed this, but when I was very young, I kept looking at the sky, and here in Mexico we have a lot of eagles. That's why it's part of our flag. So the Mexican flag holds some very interesting mysteries. You have this eagle standing on what we call it in Mexico, like nopales. Well, how would you call them in English? Cacti? Or, well, it's standing there devouring a serpent. So you have the elements of the eagle, the snake, and a sort of tree, which is also related to Roman symbols and for example, in the Germanic spiritual mysteries, you also have the eagle, the snake, and the tree, or the serpent, the world serpent, if you will. So there are some very strong symbolisms there, and you can also find these symbols in Kabbalah. So yes, very mysterious, don't you think? Back to the thing about eagles, they are constantly hunting, but when they are hunting, they are screaming, or how would you say, screeching to the top of their lungs. And at first I thought, well, that's pretty silly of the eagle. You're basically telling the other animals that here I come, I'm this predator and I'm going to eat you, and you make your presence known. But some animals actually panic when they hear this sound. You see rabbits and other smaller creatures that they listen to the eagle, the sound of the eagle, and they start running. Sometimes they actually move out of cover. So that's why the eagle is making that noise, to spot that movement. The eagle is trying to spot the prey that has been scared by the sound. So it makes sense that in a firefight, sometimes the moving targets are the ones at most risk. And of course, in more stealthy situations, you can stay just a little bit behind cover, and if you don't move too much, the enemy won't know. In the case of a fight between snipers, they won't know what killed them, who killed them, because the opponent was standing very still. Well, that's when it comes to talking about the use of firearms. Now let's move back to the use of melee weapons and unarmed fighting. I think that in current times, there are some people that have a pretty decent, if not superb, understanding when it comes to the use of swords and spears and axes and knives. They really come up with some excellent understanding of those things that are not that common in current times. There are only a few armies that practice the use of such things. For example, if I understand correctly, I don't know if it's still the thing, but about 20 years back, I saw that the Marines in the USA, they still teach how to fight with I don't remember if it was I think it was the Marines or some other corps. They taught you how to fight with, for example, shovels and things like that. And in the case of the Philippine army in the Philippines, they still teach them how to fight with short swords. I forgot the technical name of the sword that they use, because they usually fight within jungle environments, and sometimes they get really close to the enemy. So yes, it is still practiced nowadays, but and some people understand those methods. But on the other hand, we have people that are kind of like handling those martial techniques as some sort of hobby or entertainment, not as a very serious method of self-defense. Some could be thinking that's useless. Why would you learn how to fight with a sword or an axe if you don't use that in current times? But axes are still pretty common. You could purchase your axe to chop wood, or use them in other craft related activities. And you don't need to use a sword, of course, when fighting to defend yourself. You can pick up a metal pipe or a stick, and the same principles apply, but you need to treat it as a blunt weapon. In the case of the metal pipe, if it's sharp on the end, then you would be using it as a stabbing weapon as well. And some knives can be a bit long, some daggers. So yes, there is still merit in learning those techniques. And there is even more merit, in my opinion, when it comes to learning a serious unarmed fighting method, because many of the principles when it comes to striking with your hands, you can use them when using all sorts of weapons. It's the same method. In fact, I think that anyone who practices some sort of fighting method based on striking with your hands, like kempo, boxing, karate, that individual is going to have a better understanding on how to use swords when compared to some hobbyists or people that they are kind of like playing along, or LARPing, that they know how to use different old world weapons, let's say, because they don't understand the angles, the many places through which you can attack your opponent. They also do not have the right coordination, the discipline, the body conditioning, the what I said, sometimes the intent to harm or to kill from my other video. I'm going to put a link in the description below to perhaps one or two combat related videos to this talk that what I'm talking about today. So yes, if someone were to tell me you need someone to help you in this fight, which one would you choose? This guy that studies like historical martial arts, but not in a serious way, almost like a hobby way, or this karateka, boxer, kung fu practitioner? Especially in kung fu, they teach the use of different weapons, but I am talking about serious practitioners. I would choose the ones that do not practice the historical martial arts, because you could take, like I said, someone that knows kempo or a boxer. You could give him or her a sword or a knife or something, and they are going to know how to use it. They just need to act as if they were punching, but with the sharp end of the weapon. So yes, I think there is a bit of misinformation or errors in that regard. But now let's focus this on role-playing games. For a fighter to be complete when it comes to unarmed fighting, in my opinion, you have to know three things. You need to know how to strike with your hands, how to kick, and how to grapple. Those are the three basics from a technical standpoint. And this is where there is also some error of thoughts in role-playing games. Sometimes it looks like a single unarmed fighting method could serve you in all sorts of situations, like, oh, this character, for example, Anima Beyond Fantasy, the first edition or the exit version, they have all of these different fighting methods, and because it's mostly like an anime style of role-playing game, in anime anything goes when it comes to fighting, almost anything, unless it's a realistic anime. Sometimes you have very exaggerated, over-the-top versions of different traditional martial arts. And I think this is lacking, because unless you know all of those three things, punching, kicking, grappling, you're going to be at a disadvantage. Not a major one, but a potential crucial disadvantage. And why is that? This is the reason why a lot of people attack traditional martial arts. There are two main attackers to traditional martial arts. First, those that practice other martial methods or mixed martial arts because they want to bring people to their own dojo or training centers. So they're going to say, oh, karate is worthless, you should train this other discipline, or teach this, you should learn this other discipline or learn these mixed martial arts. It's also important to understand that mixed martial arts, they are not a single minded approach. If you combine two or more martial arts, that's a mixed martial art. And I think that's why they became so important. You will see different armies, like I said, different fighting groups that integrate as much as they can, as much as they possibly can, into their fighting styles. They are not only going to learn boxing, they are not only going to learn kicking, they are not going to learn just grappling, because you never know when something is necessary. To further understand this, let's say that you suddenly encountered this very dangerous enemy, someone that you do not know if he or she, I would rather say he, I will get to the she part in a few moments. You do not know if he is proficient in striking with his hands, in kicking, in grappling. So you could be thinking, well, I know grappling, but are you willing to take the risk, the chance of getting into grappling with that opponent, especially if your life is on the line? Maybe that opponent knows more about grappling than you. So you want to inflict as much damage as possible before the distances between you and your opponent close in, or become, the distance becomes almost non-existent. So as the opponent approaches, or as you are approaching your opponent, if you would use your legs, you would try to kick your opponent, especially the outer area of the legs, perhaps trying to crush the kneecaps. You will see how in many situations, usually when a kickboxer fights someone that doesn't know kicking or doesn't know what to expect of kicking, maybe that combatant only knows boxing or grappling, he is going to be at a disadvantage. Some would say it's not a major disadvantage, but you can see, and especially if you are used to seeing this in street fights, you can see the opponent that knows how to kick, he usually ends up destroying the legs of the other opponent. And in some extreme cases, like I mentioned from the video that I saw in the channel They Will Kill You, of a mixed martial artist that killed a bodybuilder by kicking him in the neck. Kicks give you that initial advantage. But let's say that you failed your kick, or you were not confident in your kicks, and now the distance between your opponent and yourself becomes a bit shorter. So now you have to rely on your fists, on perhaps your elbows. There are entire treatises talking about this. If you study the 5 Rings of Miyamoto Musashi, and I forget the name of this other book by the father of Yubei Yagyu, you know, that popular anime character Yubei Yagyu, it was Munenori Yagyu. I forgot. I forgot the name of the book, but he gives some excellent. The Sword of Life. I think it's the Sword of Life. He gives some excellent pointers on how, as the distances become shorter, you have to pay attention to different parts of the enemy. At a long distance, you have to develop this, this peripheral view, and pay attention to the legs and the hands of your opponent. The distances, as they become shorter, now you have to pay attention, because you are not able to look at the legs of the opponent. You need to look at the hip, the shoulder, the elbows. And when you are just in your enemy's face, you're going to be pretty much looking at the enemy's head and the shoulders, and you have to use those clues, if you were to call them like that, to figure out what your opponent is going to do next, because you cannot look at his knees and his hip, his torso, sometimes not even the hands, because you're up close and personal. So yes, there is a certain medium distance where you need to use your hands and your elbows instead, your knees perhaps, because kicks are not viable. And when the distances are just, yeah, a very short distance, then you need to rely on grappling. Here's a very interesting point as well. One of my viewers, Chris Donovan, he used to practice judo. Maybe he practices judo even now. Who knows? But judo is sometimes seen as an ineffective method by some people, an ineffective discipline. You can hear all sorts of things like, oh, judo is just like Jujitsu adapted to a sports environment. But it depends on the person, and it's important to remember that there are many techniques that you cannot use in a sports situation. In judo, we have the Kani Basami. Going to put a video in the description. It's a takedown, a very dangerous takedown using your legs. There is a high probability of breaking the ankle of your enemy, of the foremost leg, the leg in front. And even if the enemy manages to avoid that injury, there is still a chance that the enemy may end up falling on the back of his head, potentially dying or ending knocked out. So yes, I wouldn't underestimate judo in that regard. It's still a viable grappling method, although I think there are some limitations when compared to jiu-jitsu and catch wrestling, but it's still quite, let's say, a workable base to be successful at grappling. But in my case, I started learning jiu-jitsu. I became somewhat disappointed with some aspects of jiu-jitsu. It felt too reactive to me, too defensive. That is, in jiu-jitsu, you usually want the opponent to take the initiative, and you want to take things to the ground so that you can use your superior expertise and physical conditioning. Although this can become quite useless if the opponent is stronger than you. It's not completely useless. You can take care of opponents that are stronger than you, a bit stronger than you, but when the opponent is just overwhelming, when you are fighting an opponent of a larger frame, heavier than you, and trained and well conditioned and with the intent to harm you, you are at a great disadvantage. It's much better in those cases, in my opinion, to use striking methods. In some cases, if you think that the opponent is not very good at grappling, but like I said, are you willing to take that risk? Sometimes you want to get up close and personal as fast as possible to injure vital areas of your opponent, like the gallbladder, the neck. You don't even need to strike the crotch area or the genitals. There is this another misconception that if you kick a man in the nuts or strike with your hand, that's it. But when you are under the effects of adrenaline, you can overcome that pain, almost like a madness. It's much better to hit about three fingers above the genital area. You need about 3 kilograms of force. You can break the bone there, and that renders the hip somewhat useless. The enemy can collapse from that if you manage to break that area of the pelvis. So I think that's more useful, in my opinion. Don't focus too much on attacking the genitals as your last resort. You can try to break that if the opportunity presents itself. But just like I said, you have to be mindful of that, and I became more enamored. I fell in love with catch wrestling, catch wrestling, because you take the initiative and you are permitted, even though there are some very interesting technical methods and know-hows, brute force is also, yes, you use it in the best way possible. And when I practiced jiu-jitsu, I always became a bit frustrated because they were telling me, oh, you are relying too much on your larger frame. Because I'm usually, I'm taller I am usually taller than my opponents. Last time I measured myself, I was 1 meter and 88 centimeter. No, no, sorry. One. I need to measure myself. Well, let's say I'm pretty tall. 88. I know. Sorry, I'm pretty tall, so I need to measure myself again. So I'm usually taller than my opponent, and I was like frustrated because when you have a larger frame, you have more muscle to work with. There are some pretty tall guys that you see them and they look somewhat lanky, but they actually, because their muscles are spread out across their bones, they're actually stronger than they look. And I always wanted to use that brute force. So, when I started to get into catch wrestling, it was such a joyous occasion for me because I managed to put that into motion, into work, and I wasn't constantly corrected that that was not the Jujitsu way. I want to talk about the thing about women. You know how I said that that she could be an opponent. Women can be effective in fighting, but they are almost always at a disadvantage because men have a larger frame. That is, if you take the average woman of a country with the average man of that country, the man is usually a man who has not been weakened by eating soy, who has high levels of testosterone, who hasn't put chemical substances into his body and harmful food, processed food, and all of that. He's going to be of a larger frame compared to the woman. That means you have more protection, more shielding. So a woman, when fighting a man, she is at a significant disadvantage, just like I would be at a significant disadvantage if I were to fight someone that would be much larger than me, heavier than me, and still quite trained to use that weight in his advantage. So yes, there is a lot of disinformation. I also think that a lie to promote perhaps feminism and the like, they say that women are able to withstand pain much better, but in all situations that I have seen women fighting against men, both in sports situations, and I'm going to put a video to perhaps one of the most famous sports situations when they put a man against a woman. They usually do not end up taking pain that well. And when it comes that they tell you, oh, and women recover faster. And I've seen women that suffered fractures and they spent a lot more time recovering when compared to a man. So yes, I think that's debatable. Back to in role-playing games. Now that we know that we have seen, a lot of you already know this, but let's say that someone is watching this video and didn't take the time to learn about these things. You see that distance is very much related to the fighting methods. You usually employ kicks when you are at long range, and medium range striking with your hands. Shorter range, it's grappling. So in different role-playing games that have feats and powers and abilities, I think it's a good representation when they handle, let's say, kempo, boxing, and any hand striking method, giving you the capacity to carry out a flurry of blows, sort of attack, because that's the advantage when it comes to kicks. Kicks are very powerful, but you will never be able to kick as fast as you can punch. When you have trained your body fully, your striking with your hands, your methods to strike with your hands, they are faster and they have more pathways when compared to kicks. You cannot twist your legs as easily as you can with your hands, and that's what I love about kempo. I actually prefer kempo to boxing because you have some very unusual strikes that take the opponent by surprise. A lot of people don't know that you can actually hit like that. That is almost like a reverse hammer strike. Or this also appears in karate, if I'm not mistaken, in some styles of karate. When you hit with your backhand, you strike this area over here. So there are a lot of even some kung fu striking methods that injure some very interesting parts of the body. Those methods can be considered useless by some practitioners, but that's based on ignorance and not a proper way of training. For example, striking with your fingers. There are many methods, some forms that include these like wavy motions with your fingers, and you could think that's very silly. How much damage can you inflict with your fingers? But just take a look at some striking. You could see some videos here in YouTube striking with their fingers. You can train your fingers to the point that you could, for example, in my case, I'm still not comfortable in doing a lot of push-ups with a single finger because I always feel like I need to strengthen that finger a bit more, or I think I'm going to injure myself. But I can easily do push-ups with two fingers, and that's when you properly train your fingers to strike different areas, usually vulnerable areas like eyes, neck, and all of that. But with properly trained fingers, you can end up like, for example, getting your finger right there in the gallbladder, some areas of the stomach. You can cause a lot of pain. One of my instructors, and I actually think he's a good example of how you shouldn't train your body, he never properly understood and he became too dogmatic. That's one of the problems with traditional martial arts as they are taught by some people. They treat them like religion. Traditional martial arts are good as long as you add them to your repertoire, as long as you treat them as tools that you can use, that you can pull out from your toolbox. You need all sorts of techniques and knowledge to be a complete fighter. So when it comes to, like I said, striking with your fingers and all of that, this instructor, he had a terrible, first of all, terrible diet, eating all sorts of nasty food, fast food, and drinking, your sodas and all of that. Those harm your bones. So when he was much when he was much younger, he started doing that he starts to strike all sorts of hard surfaces with his fingers to the point that they became quite deformed. He could actually strike through a thin board with his fingers, break the board, but when it comes to writing or typing in his computer, he had such a difficult time. His fingers had been quite deformed. And later on, he started to advise all of his students that, oh, don't train your fingers. You're going to end up with calcium related problems and you're going to end up with deformed hands like mine. To properly train your fingers, you need a good diet. And yes, you can strike and start putting, like, filling a bucket with some rocks or pebbles or sand and you hit them. Some take more extreme measures. I think they are unnecessary. Sometimes they hit those stones, they add heat to the stones or the sand so that it's burning up, and then they start to kill the nerves of their hands like that. That's quite moronic in my opinion. You don't need to do that, especially when you practice, like I said, meditation methods. You can look for your own more intense meditation methods, and I've recommended the Wim Hof method and sun gazing. If you do those methods correctly, you learn to withstand pain. You don't need to kill your nerves. And just imagine sex, one of the greatest pleasures in life. You will lose that sensitivity in your hands? That's insane. So, when it comes to striking, I would recommend that you strike sand and stones, and later on, when you progress, in my case, I hit trees with my fingers, and I rake those trees with my fingers, and nothing is going to happen to your fingers. I'm 39 years old, soon to be 40 years old in this year, and I've never had problems with that in that regard. So all of those striking techniques that have to do with fingers, they are plausible, but a lot of people that criticize traditional martial arts, they take a look at those techniques and they think that it's impossible. But no, if you train properly, and I've also said that you should climb when possible, you should pick very heavy things with your fingers, just your fingers, not with your entire hand. Use your fingers and you will be able to lift some pretty heavy things. That's also necessary for techniques that have to do with tiger palm strikes, to rake the flesh of your enemy. So in role-playing games, all of those hand techniques are perfect for flurry of blows sort of attacks. If you want to add some sort of balance to the methods or techniques rules wise, you could say that, oh well, you can inflict 3 or 4 attacks, but you get a penalty when it comes to accuracy, just to make things balanced. In real life, when you are doing those techniques, you're not going to take, and you have properly trained, and your body is properly conditioned, and you have that intent to harm or to kill, depending on the situation, you're not going to suffer penalties to your accuracy. When it comes to kicking, they're always going to be more powerful than a blow using your fist or your hand. The muscles of the legs are more powerful than the muscles of the arms. And so whenever you handle kicks in role-playing games, they have to be this sort of power attack, sort of maneuver or ability. Because at the same time, someone that is experienced in defending yourself against kicking, you can sometimes predict or the kick of the opponent. You can see that telegraph, so to speak, when the opponent is going to kick you. So then you can move to the side or duck or injure the leg of the opponent if you know how to. There are some, in traditional martial arts, there are some guards that are poorly understood. In karate, they have this, I don't see, let's see if I can get that into camera, this sort of guard. You're basically trying to catch the kick of your opponent, usually a somewhat low roundhouse kick, or some fan kicks could also apply. And the opponent is trying to kick you, so you're going to try to stop the kick with your elbow while at the same time capturing it, but you also need to move to the side just in case that your opponent has superbly conditioned legs. He could end up injuring your arm, so you want to move to the side to sort of cushion the blow while catching the leg with this hand and blocking with your elbow. And then you do some other thing immediately, of course, to counter. So when it comes to kicks, they are going to be inflicting more damage when compared to fists, at least raw damage. Sometimes it's very difficult to get the kick into those vulnerable spots. Although there are exceptions, like I said, of that mixed martial artist that killed the bodybuilder by kicking his neck. He must have been quite fast when doing so. Or maybe the bodybuilder became too overconfident because of the strength of his neck. Who knows? I have taken a kick to the neck, and if I didn't, it's one of those pains that remains with you. If I didn't move to the side just in time and I didn't make it so that the kick was in this area where there are muscles, if the kick would have gone here, I probably would have died. But I managed to get this area and, how would you say, tense the muscles of my neck as much as possible. That saved my life, in my opinion. So in the case of the bodybuilder, maybe he took it straight to the Adam's apple. But those are exceptional cases. And that's when you are fighting a very skilled opponent. In my case, I was fighting against someone who was proficient in Tae Kwon Do. So he had very fast kicks. That encounter ended in a draw, the typical situation in which you kind of like get separated. But when it comes to kicking in role-playing games, kicks are usually more powerful, but it's harder to land. I think it also depends on how knowledgeable, like I said, the opponent is about kicking. Like I said, a boxer who has never fought someone who kicks superbly, excellently, he's going to end up with some very nasty blows. Perhaps he will lose that fight as he tries to close the distance to get those hands in there. The one who kicks, especially if it's a practitioner of Tae Kwon Do that has long legs, and I'm talking about not the McDojo sort of Tae Kwon Do, I'm talking serious Tae Kwon Do, he could end up destroying the legs of the boxer, or a kickboxer could end up destroying the legs of the boxer. And in the case of grappling, I will also recommend that you practice striking, because that's why in many role-playing games, sometimes you want to grapple the opponent, unless you spend something like a feat or whatever to train your character in grappling, the opponent gets a chance to carry out an attack of opportunity. He hits you, and sometimes if they inflict damage, the grapple is cancelled. Maybe, it depends on the system variation. So when it comes to applying martial arts and fighting methods in role-playing games, you have to take all of that into consideration, especially if you want to apply some sort of balance in your game. Mm. Now, concerning the use of blades and axes and all of that, I would highly recommend that you look for more serious historical martial artists. There are some that are really good, some that are frauds. There is a very popular YouTuber. He doesn't only talk about fighting methods, he also talks about. I don't want to say his name because it's not an attack against him, but an attack against frauds in general. He plays this Britishy stereotype. A lot of you know who I'm talking about. In some of his older videos, he didn't know the difference between blocking and parrying. Those of you that don't know the difference, blocking is basically that, putting a part of your body to stop the attack of the opponent. But when it comes to parrying, you are deflecting, deviating the attacks of the opponent. Parrying is much better, it's more finesse based, because if someone is like, let's say that your opponent has this meaty fist and he's going to hit you in the head, it's much better to bat it to the side instead of putting your hand to stop it, unless you have a really well conditioned hand and you're superior to your opponent in terms of physique. I once saw a video of a really big guy that stopped another guy from punching another guy. He kind of looked like this Russian stereotype of an Igor sort of guy. You know, like the typical, like really big guy. And he stopped the hand of the other guy, and the other guy was completely dwarfed by this man. And he was very, you could say, a very merciful guy, because he just stopped the hit of the other dude, and he went like this, like, don't even try it. And he let him go. He could have easily destroyed the other guy, but you can tell that he's probably a nice guy. So, when it comes, like I said, at this guy that didn't know the difference between parrying and blocking, and he also said that dual wielding was useless. Just take a look at some of those videos, those that practice Eskrima with 2 sticks, not even 2 blades, 2 sticks. The skilled Eskrima practitioner, a true practitioner, not the ones that are just showing off fancy techniques, those that know what works in a real fight, they are, well, almost flawless in their execution, I would say. So, like I said, there is this misconception or misinformation concerning those methods when it comes to historical martial arts. And there's also this, I would say, a fetishism, you could call it, like a fetish of idolizing all of the techniques from the East. A lot of people do not know this, but in catch wrestling, you have the double wrist lock, and they call it the Kimura as well. So some think, oh, it's the Kimura. They probably took that from Japan, but it was actually taught to a Japanese person, the Kimura guy that was teaching everyone this double wrist lock. He learned that from, I think it was English wrestling. Look for the Kimura or double wrist lock and any old-fashioned catch wrestler, or the origins of the Kimura, or the origins of the double wrist lock, Billy Robinson, and you will see the story behind that, the history behind that. In this other book, Secrets of the Samurai, by Oscar Ratti and Daniel Westwood, I think, they also spoke about how sometimes warriors from Japan would travel to the West, to Europe, to learn different fighting methods. They worked as servants or workers or bodyguards, but at the same time they were learning all of those techniques when it comes to what you would say a more primitive way of boxing and wrestling, and even sword fighting techniques, and they took that knowledge back to Japan. So yes, we need to keep that into consideration in terms of fighting methods and sword fighting, axe fighting, knife fighting, using your shield in role-playing games. You just need to understand the mechanics of unarmed fighting and apply that to using weapons, and you will understand the fundamentals and perhaps even come up with your own mechanics to apply those techniques. Well, I wanted to focus this video on unarmed fighting methods to give a solid base, to potentially give a solid base, because I could have gone into further details when it comes to sword fighting and the use of firearms. But for example, in the case of the use of firearms, I am not really knowledgeable in that regard. Just like the basics, meat and potatoes, in a sense. When it comes to the use of different weapons, there are weapons that I know nothing about when it comes to their use, like the nunchucks. There are some weirder weapons, like the section staff, and that are kind of like oversized nunchucks as well. There are plenty of melee weapons that I am not entirely familiar in their use, so I cannot give you too much advice on that. But when it comes to the use of swords and knives and axes, apply those principles of unarmed fighting. When it comes to when I was moving through the grades in a particular system where they taught the use of weapons, I immediately noticed that the way that they were teaching the use of the katana and the bow staff and short stick, it's just an extension of using your hands. So if you know how to fight using your hands, you have a firm grasp on how to use those melee weapons. And I hope this information, you will find it useful when using it in your role-playing games. Maybe you will take a different... It will change your perspective, in the case of some of you, on how to handle wrestling or catch wrestling and the use of striking with your hands and legs, apply some penalties or bonuses. Just one last thing when it comes to grappling. I think it makes some sense when someone is not very proficient or an expert in grappling that you need one turn in a combat round to take hold of your opponent, and you only get to inflict damage in the next turn or carry out some sort of other maneuver. But for someone that has trained a lot in, like I said, Judo, catch wrestling, Jujitsu, in the case of Judo, the Kani Basami, that's a great example of a takedown, of a grappling maneuver, perhaps a sweep, that immediately inflicts damage then if it was a role-playing game, in that same turn. And when it comes to a catch wrestler, you can easily inflict damage right away to your opponent. You could even cause real damage to a limb or the neck. So yes, take that into consideration when you are applying grappling. It could be that you need to spend a few feats or abilities that, oh, my character has leveled up, now I can train in this, in grappling, before you can actually inflict damage in the same turn. In most cases, it's going to be you immobilize your opponent, and in the next turn you can inflict damage. So thank you for watching this video. Even though I spoke about various things, I still feel like this video was incomplete because it's such a vast and complex subject, but I still hope that this information proves useful, if not entertaining. So thank you once again for watching this video, and if you have any comments or questions, please let me know. And thank you so much to those of you that have been supporting the channel by sending drive-thru RPG gift certificates. If anyone else wants to further support the channel, the information on how to do that will be in the description below. Once again, thank you, and see you later.